You've heard of strange places before, haven't you? The kind of places that defy logic, where the rules don't make sense, but you can't seem to escape them. This is one of those places. But trust me, it's not like anything you've ever imagined. A small motel, tucked away in the Ozarks, it's anything but ordinary. If you're already feeling the tension building, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the story so far. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button to join the Creepypasta HQ family, where chilling tales like this are waiting to haunt you every week. Don't miss out on what comes next. Trust me, you won't want to. I never meant to work at the Ozark Motel, but life has a way of steering you down unexpected paths, and before I knew it, I was standing behind the counter in the middle of nowhere, working the night shift. I had heard rumors about this place, how the air seemed a little too still, how things weren't quite as they seemed, but I never thought they were more than local folklore. That is, until I arrived. The motel sat on a lonely stretch of highway, bordered by dense woods and forgotten roads. The kind of place where strangers came and went, where time seemed to blur into one endless, hazy night. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a dim glow over the cracked pavement. The sign itself read, Ozark Motel, in bold, faded letters, almost like it had been there longer than anyone could remember. At first glance, it looked just like any other roadside stop, but there was something off about it. Something unsettling in the way the wind whispered through the trees, the way the air felt heavier when you stepped through the motel's front door. And the guests? Well, that's where things started to get weird. I've worked the night shift for about a week now, and every night I follow the same routine. Check in guests, answer the phone, make sure everything's in order. It's quiet, eerie even. The kind of quiet that makes you wonder if the silence is waiting for something, if it's holding its breath, waiting for the moment when it's going to break. And every night as the hours drag on, I feel it more and more. The feeling that something is watching, something waiting. The first night I worked there, I was eager to prove myself. The boss, Old Roy, is a man of few words. A gruff, middle-aged guy who spends most of his time sitting in the back office, drinking coffee and smoking his cheap cigarettes. I don't blame him. The motel's got a reputation for weird happenings, and I think Old Roy's learned to just keep his head down and ignore it all. Just do your job, he said, without even looking up from his paperwork. And don't ask too many questions, you'll figure it out. At first, I thought it was just his way of being cryptic, like he was just trying to add a little mystery to the whole place. But soon enough, I realized that his warning wasn't just for show. It was a genuine piece of advice. I remember the first guest I checked in like it was yesterday. He was a middle-aged man, wearing an old leather jacket that looked like it had been through hell and back. He had a grizzled face, covered with a scruffy beard, and his eyes were tired, too tired, like he'd been running from something. The man barely said a word when he walked up to the counter, just handed me his ID and tossed a few bills on the counter. He had a strange look in his eye, though, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I handed him the key to room 9. It was an odd room number, one that didn't sit right with me. There was no logical reason for it, but in the Ozark Motel, there was no such thing as logic. Stay out of room 9. Old Roy had told me during my training. Let's just say it's been the scene of some strange events over the years. If you see someone checking in there, don't ask questions. Just give them the key and let them be. As I handed the man the key to that room, he didn't even flinch. His eyes stayed fixed on me, cold and unblinking. Thanks, he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. I watched him leave, making his way to room 9 with deliberate steps, like he knew exactly where he was going, like he'd been here before. And maybe he had. But I didn't have time to think about it then. There was more to worry about. After all, this was my first night, and I had a job to do. The rules at the Ozark Motel are simple. They're written on a piece of yellowed paper behind the counter, laminated and faded from years of handling. And no matter how hard you try to ignore them, the rules have a way of making themselves known. There's the usual stuff, of course. No loud noise after 10 p.m., no smoking inside the rooms, check out by noon. But then there are the strange rules, the ones that don't make any sense. The ones you don't question because, after all, you're just doing your job. Rule number 1. No guest is allowed to stay in room 9 for more than one night. It's a simple rule, but it's one I've learned to follow without question. There's something about room 9 that makes people different. I don't know what it is, but I've seen it in their eyes when they leave the next day. Something haunted, something distant. The kind of look that says they've seen something they weren't meant to see. And that's when I start to wonder, what exactly happens in that room? Rule number 2. Never, under any circumstances, go into room 6 after 2 a.m. This rule, too, makes no sense. Room 6 is located in the back of the motel, far away from the others, and it's always been locked. But every now and then, you'll hear strange noises coming from it. Scratching sounds, faint whispers, the sound of footsteps. And once, I swear, I saw a shadow moving across the window. On my second night, I had a guest who came in at around 2 a.m. He was wearing a tattered suit, his face pale and gaunt. His clothes were disheveled, as though he had been walking for days without rest. When he checked in, his hands were shaking, and his breath was labored, as if he had just run a marathon. I tried to ask if everything was okay, but he just shook his head, muttered something about the woods, and handed me the cash for a night's stay. It was obvious he wasn't in his right mind. His eyes darted around the lobby, as though he were searching for something. Or someone. But when I offered him a room key, his gaze fell on room 9, and he froze. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. "You sure you don't want a different room?" I asked, trying to break the tension. But he simply nodded, as if he had no choice. "Room 9, he said softly, almost like he was confirming something to himself. I handed him the key, and off he went. I watched him disappear down the hallway, his footsteps echoing faintly in the silence. And for a brief moment, I thought I heard something else. Something heavy, like the sound of a door creaking open behind him. But when I turned around, no one was there. I couldn't explain it, but something felt off about that man. And for the first time, I began to wonder if I was starting to buy into the stories, the whispers, the rumors. Maybe there was something to the rules after all. Later that night, after the lobby fell quiet and the clock ticked past midnight, I found myself sitting at the counter, absent-mindedly flipping through an old magazine. The stillness was suffocating, like the motel itself was holding its breath. Then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of room 9. At first I thought it was the man from earlier, but when I looked up, the hallway was empty. No one was there. I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right, but the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The air grew colder, heavier, as though something had just stepped into the room with me. The silence, now oppressive, weighed on me like 100 unseen eyes were watching from every corner of the motel. Suddenly the phone rang. I jumped, startled by the sound. I reached over and picked it up, my hand trembling slightly. "Hello," I said, trying to steady my voice. There was no response, just static, and then a faint whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. "Get out." I froze. The voice was unmistakable, but I didn't recognize it. The line went dead. I didn't know what to make of it, but I had a feeling the strange rules weren't just for show. Something was happening at the Ozark motel, something I couldn't explain. And the longer I stayed here, the more I felt the pull, the quiet pressure to follow the rules, to stay out of certain rooms and never ever ask questions. Because in this place, the rules were the only things keeping you safe. The night holds its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. And in the Ozark motel, when it's quiet, that's when you should be most afraid. The rain started at dusk, light at first, but soon it became a relentless downpour, drumming against the motel's roof with a rhythmic fury. It was the kind of storm that left you feeling trapped, like the world outside had ceased to exist, and you were stuck here, in this place, with nowhere to run. I should have known then that something was wrong. But back then, I thought it was just the storm. I didn't understand. Not yet. The night began like any other, with the usual quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above the counter, the dull echo of the clock ticking away in the corner. Old Roy had gone to the back office, muttering something about taking a break. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him look relaxed, but I wasn't thinking about that at the time. My mind kept drifting back to the events of the night before. That man, the one who stayed in room 9. The one who'd checked out early and disappeared into the night. I couldn't stop thinking about him. His hollow eyes, his unspoken fear, and the way he'd looked at me like he was asking for help but was too afraid to speak. But there was nothing I could do for him. Not really. I'd handed him the key. I'd followed the rules. That was all I could do. Or was it? The first sign that something was off came when I checked the security footage. I don't usually check the cameras, there's no real reason to. The motel is quiet, and people come and go without issue. But that night, something compelled me to look. The footage from the night before was grainy, distorted by the static of the old system. But what I saw made my blood run cold. I watched as the man from room 9 walked down the hallway. He stopped outside the door as if hesitating, before disappearing into the room. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he was being guided by some unseen force. Then, nothing. The camera on that hallway flickered for a moment, the screen going black for just a second. When it came back on, there was no sign of the man. I replayed the footage several times, but each time it was the same. The man had entered room 9 and then vanished. No checkout, no return to the lobby, nothing. It was just past midnight when the phone rang. I had already made my rounds, checking the rooms and making sure everything was in order. I sat behind the counter, trying to steady my nerves after the unsettling footage. I picked up the receiver, the cold plastic pressing against my ear. "Hello?" I said, trying to keep my voice even. The voice on the other end was distorted, the static cutting in and out. It was almost too faint to hear. "Don't go near room 9, the voice whispered, barely audible. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Who is this?" I demanded, my throat dry. "What do you want?" The line went dead. I sat there, stunned, my fingers still gripping the phone. The silence that followed was deafening. It felt like the whole motel had drawn in a collective breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to some prank caller trying to mess with me. But another part, the part deep inside, the one that had started to believe the rumors, told me to listen. Don't go near room 9. I couldn't ignore it. I had to check. The rain beat harder against the windows as I stepped out from behind the counter and made my way down the hallway. My footsteps were muffled against the carpet, but my heartbeat thundered in my chest. I reached room 9 faster than I expected. Too fast. It was as if my legs were moving on their own, propelled by an unseen force, drawing me closer to the door. The hallway was silent, save for the sound of the rain outside. The other rooms were dark, their doors closed, their occupants presumably asleep. But room 9, it wasn't dark. A sliver of light escaped from the crack beneath the door, casting an eerie glow onto the floor. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to walk away and forget all of it. But my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't leave now. Not after everything that had happened. Slowly, I turned the handle. The door creaked as it opened, the sound echoing louder than I anticipated. I stepped inside, the air cool and damp. The room was different from the last time I'd seen it. It wasn't just empty. It was altered. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled in a way that felt wrong, like someone had been thrashing in their sleep. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the wind, though there was no sign of anyone having gone through it. But it was the walls that caught my attention. Scrawled on the walls were symbols. Not just random scribbles, but intricate patterns, overlapping and weaving together in ways that made no sense. The symbols were drawn in red. Streaks of it ran down the walls, as if someone had poured it, but there was no sign of any substance that could have left those marks. I stepped closer, the hairs on my neck standing up. My breathing grew shallow as I examined the symbols. They were familiar, but I couldn't place them. Something deep inside me stirred, a feeling I couldn't shake. It was like I had seen them before, in a dream, or maybe in a memory that was too far gone to reach. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, making me jump. The air grew colder, and I turned around, my pulse racing. A figure stood in the doorway. It was him, the man who had stayed here before. But he was different. His face was more hollow, his eyes dark, like there was nothing left of him. He wasn't alive. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, unable to take my eyes off of him. He spoke, his voice low and rasping, as if he were speaking from far away. "They're coming. They know what you did." His words echoed in my mind long after he disappeared. I didn't know what I had done, but I was starting to feel the weight of it. The sense that the motel, its rules, and its strange energy weren't just stories. They were real. I had broken the rule. I had entered room 9. And now I couldn't leave. The rain had stopped by the time I returned to the lobby, but the air still felt thick with the unease that had taken hold of me. I could still see the symbols on the walls, still hear the man's voice in my head. I sat behind the counter, my hands trembling, unsure of what to do next. And then I remembered the warning. "They're coming. They know what you did." It was late when the first guest arrived, a woman in a long coat, her hair wet from the rain. She looked like she was in a hurry, anxious to get inside. She handed me a handful of cash, her eyes darting nervously around the lobby. "Room 9, she said, her voice trembling. "I need a room for the night." I felt a chill race down my spine. I was about to tell her that room 9 was unavailable, that no one should ever stay there, but then I remembered the rules, and more importantly, I remembered what I had seen. My hand reached for the key. I had to make a choice. I could let her stay, let the cycle continue, or I could stop her before it was too late. But that's the thing about the Ozark Motel. There's always a choice, but never an easy one. And once the door to room 9 opens, it's hard to tell if anyone will ever truly leave. You ever feel like you're walking in circles? That you've been here before, seen this before, even though it feels like you've just arrived? That's the thing about the Ozark Motel. It doesn't care how you get there. It just knows you're coming. The night fell heavier than I'd expected. The rain had stopped, but the darkness lingered, like a shroud that refused to lift. I had handed the woman the key to room 9 without thinking. Her eyes met mine for a moment, searching, probing, but I didn't look away this time. I couldn't. She took the key, her grip tight, like she was holding on to something more than just metal. And then she disappeared into the hall. The clock ticked on, each second stretching longer than the last. Every shadow seemed darker, the silence more suffocating. I could feel it in my bones, the same pressure that had been building up since I first set foot in this place. The phone rang again. I stared at it, the sound seeming so distant now, like a call from another world. But I had no choice. I had to answer. "Hello?" I said, my voice hollow, distant even to my own ears. The line crackled for a moment, static buzzing in my ear like a swarm of angry bees. And then the voice. "Don't let her in." It was the same voice, the same low, rasping whisper that had warned me before. But this time, there was no fear in it, just cold, absolute certainty. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Who is it? What do you want?" But the voice didn't respond. It just faded into nothingness. The line went dead again. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, trying to catch my breath. A new wave of dread washed over me. The same voice, the same warning, but now it felt different, like I had been caught in something I didn't fully understand. I had made the wrong choice. I knew it then. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The stillness in the motel grew thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in around me. The clock on the wall ticked louder in the silence, like a countdown to something inevitable. Then the door opened. I didn't hear footsteps, not at first. But when I looked up, I saw her. The woman. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, empty. She was shaking, her clothes soaked through, as if she had walked through the storm again. Her lips were trembling. But it wasn't fear I saw on her face. It was something else, something I couldn't quite name. But then I noticed something. The key she had been given, it was no longer in her hand. Instead, it was in the door. A key to room 9, left outside for anyone to take. The woman stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was being pulled by some invisible force. "Room 9, she muttered, her voice hollow. I couldn't leave. I stood frozen behind the counter, my breath caught in my throat. My pulse was erratic now, thumping hard against my ribcage. I wanted to ask her what had happened, but I couldn't form the words. Her eyes locked onto mine, and then, without warning, her face contorted in pain, a look of pure terror. "Why did you let me go in?" she gasped, her voice rising with desperation. Why? Why did you let me go back? I took a step forward, but it was too late. Her body jerked violently, and before my eyes she collapsed onto the floor, her face frozen in an expression of agony. But there was no sound, no scream, just silence. She was gone. The room grew colder, a chill that sank into my bones and refused to let go. I stared at her lifeless body, the silence pressing against me. I felt empty, hollow, and that's when I heard it, a faint sound like a soft whisper from the other side of the room. I turned, but no one was there. Another whisper. Closer this time. And then suddenly a figure materialized in the doorway. It was him, the man from room 9. But his face wasn't the same. It was older, his eyes were hollow, drained of all color. And there, in the back of the room, stood the woman. Her body was still on the floor, but her eyes were open now, empty. She was standing too, staring, the two of them together, silent, watching me. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. My mind was spiraling out of control, and then he spoke. "Welcome to your room," he said, his voice cold, distant. "I didn't think you'd be here for long, but now you're part of it, there's no leaving." I tried to speak, to argue, but nothing came out. And then, everything went dark. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the motel lobby. The air was still, unnaturally so. It felt like the world had paused, as if it had been waiting for something to happen. The phone rang. I reached for it automatically, my hands trembling, but when I picked it up, no one was on the other end. Just the sound of faint breathing, the same rasping, hollow breath. It was like the call had come from somewhere else, somewhere deep within the walls. I hung up, my hands shaking. I glanced around the empty lobby, the quiet almost suffocating now. The clock ticked louder than before, and I noticed something strange. The door to room 9. It was slightly open. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at it, my heart racing. And then, like a pull I couldn't resist, I found myself walking toward it. The room, it called to me. I opened the door, and there they were. The man and the woman, standing side by side, waiting, their faces blank, empty, and behind them, the symbols, all over the walls, new ones, old ones. The last thing I remember was the sound of the door creaking shut behind me, and then silence. As the door closed, I realized it was never about leaving, it was about becoming. If you've made it this far, you know something's not right with the Ozark Motel, and neither do we. But don't just take my word for it. If you're brave enough, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Have you stayed in a place like this? Ever felt like something's watching you from the shadows? Let's talk about it. And if you want to uncover more eerie mysteries, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter in this terrifying journey. But remember, some places are better left unexplored.